If you've got your Bibles, turn with me to Ecclesiastes chapter 8. When we started this journey, my goal was to get Ecclesiastes finished in 8 weeks. It looks like it'll be more like 20 by the time we're done, but that's okay. We're getting there. For me, this question answers, this chapter answers a question that Roger Harrison asked me a couple of weeks ago. He said, Matt, that sermon you did on injustice, it was important, but what do I do about it? Well, I think Solomon now answers that question. Now, we've got a bit of a feedback loop happening here. I'm hearing myself come back. All good, that's great. If you've got a digital device, you can actually download the notes for this sermon on the YouVersion app. For me, I find this quite the journey with Ecclesiastes has been an important one in my life, and again, even as we re-engage with it. There's a guy called the name Peter Kreeft. Now, you've heard me say this a few times, but this is why we're doing it. He's saying Ecclesiastes is the book that modern people most need to read, because it's lesson 1 and the rest of the Bible is lesson 2. He's saying there are lots of different approaches to life, of which the Bible gives you the one that is actually going to work, but unless you face the fact that your ways are not going to work, you won't be ready for the truth of the Bible, is what he's saying. So let's read verse 1. Solomon now picks it up and says, "Who is like the wise? Who knows the explanation of things? A person's wisdom brightens their face and changes its hard appearance." A person's wisdom brightens their face and changes their hard appearance. What he's saying is, the wiser you are, the more relaxed you can approach life with, the more relaxed approach you can have to life. Remember, what is wisdom? Wisdom is seeing the world literally from God's perspective. Is a Hebrew understanding of what wisdom is. And if you are truly wise, then what you are able to do is say, look, the steering wheel of life isn't in my hands. It's in God's hands. And if it's in God's hands, then it's in the hands of someone who actually knows what they're doing, as opposed to me. And so the life is less stressful. A wise person is one who places the burden of life on the right shoulders. A wise person is one who places the burden of life on the right shoulders. And one of my favourite verses is, I think Jesus was speaking to this specifically when he was speaking in the book of Matthew. And if you sort of flick over to Matthew chapter 11, this is an important reminder for me, where Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you." It's interesting, for the Jewish people, the rabbis would often talk about their yoke being their way of seeing the world, or their teaching. So what Jesus is saying, take my teaching, is literally, in a rabbinical, is what he's saying. Take my teaching, is take that on, learn from me, because I am gentle and humble in heart, and listen to this, you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Does your soul need rest? Jesus this morning is saying, come on, come to me. I wonder, implicit in that is this understanding that when we put on the wrong burdens, that's where life can feel too much. I wonder for you, are there wrong burdens that you are carrying? I think that's implicit in what Jesus is saying. So this is where Solomon starts. It's interesting, Solomon starts here, and then he says, now let's talk about the kind of work you might need to do. And he actually starts to talk about how you address power. And just a thing to say up front is if you were born in Australia, or if you've been shaped by Australian culture, you will be annoyed at what Solomon's about to say. Because this is about as anti-Australian as you can possibly get. Because what does he say? Well, in a minute we'll unpack it, but it's important to understand this sense that as he starts to talk about the king, and he's going to talk about the king, we need to understand that authority, real authority, is about influence. And if you are a follower of Jesus, you are not here to take up space, you are actually here to have influence. And we need to know, as what Solomon will be saying to us, is we need to know how to engage with people in authority if we want to have influence. We need to know how to engage with people in authority if we want to have influence. So Solomon now says something that Australians find hard. Obey the king's command, he says. I say because you took an oath before God. He's saying, do what the person in power says. The Australian soldiers in World War I and World War II actually developed a reputation for not wanting to salute their commanding officers that they didn't respect. When they saluted, it was a sign of respect. And if you're Australian, you'll kind of smile at that. Because have you noticed there's an anti-authoritarian streak in Australians? We're not so big on authority. And I actually think we need to allow ourselves to be confronted by the Bible here. Romans 13, if you say this is just an Old Testament thing, Matt, well, listen to what Paul says in Romans chapter 13. He says, again, something that's a bit confronting to us Aussies, let everyone be subject to governing authorities. For there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you'll be commended. We need to start by hearing this and hearing this deeply, because there is a grid, if you're Australian, that you'll just want to avoid. What Paul's saying here, what Solomon's saying here. We are called to respect those in authority. Good, I haven't been stoned yet. That's good. But can you, if you've been shaped by Australia, can you feel yourself wanting to rebel against that? If you've been shaped by Australian culture, there is a good chance you'll be wanting to rebel against that. If not, that's great. Now Solomon goes on and he says two things in quick succession. And I think these are important to hear in terms of understanding how do you engage with people in authority. And when I'm talking about people in authority, I'm talking about, think about every structure you're part of, whether it be politicians or parents, or whether it be people in authority in a workplace, or people in Centrelink, anybody in authority. Think about in terms of what that means. And he says, do not be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. Now that's again very anti-Australian thing to say. Don't be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. What's he saying? He's saying be intentional to build positive relationships with those in authority. You need to understand what life is like for them. Think of any controversial issue. Any controversial issue. And usually what has happened is one side sees one side of the story and the other sees the other side of the story, and usually people in authority are doing their very best to address a complicated issue. For me, a classic example is there are, as we all know, there are kids on the island of Manus Island putting up with things that kids shouldn't have to put up with. And it's horrible. But those people who are advocating to free the kids need to understand that the politicians who are put the process in place that has them there are dealing with another complex issue, and that is, what does it mean to maintain the integrity of Australia's borders, and particularly for those coming across in boats, and we've seen literally, I think hundreds, I don't think it's an exaggeration, of people die in some of these rickety boats that are being ripped, you know. So politicians are trying to work out these two, what seem like polar opposite questions, and in order to really free the kids off Manus Island, those people who are advocating for that need to help to understand the world of the politicians. Does that make sense? And then find a way to help them find an answer to those questions. Similarly, I think there's a closer example to home, and that is every year we in the church get upset about dark mofo. And there are people in authority trying to create an arts thing in Hobart, and some of it is just dark and horrible and quite serious. But the danger is when we reduce the issue to us and them and see them as the enemy, we are doing exactly the thing that we're frustrated that they're doing. Does that make sense? Whenever any issue is reduced to where us and them, we are not seeing or humanizing the other side. And in order to bring peace, we actually need to see the world from the perspective, in Solomon's terms, of the king. We need to be in and understand what is going on there for the politicians, and what is the intent, and see if we can find ways of addressing the intent and speaking to the other side. It is important in your workplace to understand what life is like for your boss, if you actually want to bring about change. It's important in your school to understand what life is like for your teacher, if you actually want to bring about change. If as a kid you are frustrated with how your parents are operating, you know, and putting rules in, you need to, if you really want to bring about change, you need to see if you can put yourself in your parents' shoes and work out, what does it mean? This is what Solomon's saying. Do not be in a hurry to leave the presence of the king. My son, Josh, is addicted, you might not know this, he's addicted to musicals. He just loves musicals, in particular the musical Hamilton. Has anyone heard of the musical Hamilton? It's a new one. It's about a politician, and it's a fairly new one, and it's one of the most popular musicals at the moment. And there's a song in that where Hamilton, who is on the played by I forget his name. Josh will be yelling at me over at Mornington. I just can't hear him at the moment. Anyway, he's played by he's played by someone, and he's talking to a fellow called Aaron Burr, who would ultimately end up shooting him as part of American history. But there's a song that's called "The Room Where It Happens," and it's kind of saying that decisions are made by those who show up. Decisions are made by those who are in the room. And if you want to make change, you need to be in the room. One of the things I think we need to face is sometimes it's easier to stand out of the room and get frustrated with the people in the room than actually understand what life is like for those in the room. And I think that's what Solomon's saying when he says, where he says, do not be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. Then he says something else. He says, don't stand up for a bad cause, for he'll do what he pleases. He's saying, when you decide to engage with someone in authority, one sure way to lose influence is to stand up for a bad cause, to stand up for something that isn't actually about something that's morally right or wrong. For those who have done foundations, you'll know the glory of God is reflected in God's justice and mercy and compassion. It's the Hebrew word for glory is kavod or kabod. It means weight. A bad cause is one that's not about justice, mercy and compassion. But often people are we've just interestingly heard the last couple of days, Paul Manafort, who was one of Donald Trump's advisors, or was his campaign manager, has been paid millions of dollars to stand up for bad causes, and he's just admitted to that. He's been paid millions of dollars to stand up for a corrupt politician in the Ukraine, and he paid for others to come and lobby on his behalf. And the result of that is that Paul Manafort is now facing a jail term. When you stand up for a bad cause, ultimately you lose authority, is what Solomon's saying. Now he comes and he says, since a king's word is supreme, who can say to him, what are you doing? And again, this is an interesting one for us to face as Australians, because often we put ourselves over those in authority and we want to judge them. We need, Solomon's saying, to respect our place relative to those in authority. We need to respect our place relative to those in authority. We need to, if the Bible says we're to be praying for those who are our political leaders. We need, if you are at school, your job isn't to judge your principal. Your job is to respect your place relative to the person in authority. If you're in a family, your job is to respect your parents. The Bible's pretty clear on that. Our job isn't to stand over and say, what are you doing? And in verses 5 and 6, we get a sense, though, that that doesn't then mean you don't ever stand up for something. You don't ever try to bring change. He says, whoever obeys his command will come to no harm, and the wise heart, listen to this, will know the proper time and procedure, for there is a proper time and procedure for every matter, though a person may be weighed down by misery. What he's saying is that there is a proper time to stand up for what's right. But interesting, that what determines the proper time is not how you're feeling. One of my favourite books that I'm hoping at some point we'll get a chance to really dig into is the book of Nehemiah. In Nehemiah is heartbroken where he hears how the walls are crumbling. But he waits months before he actually allows the king to see his heart is broken. He waits for the proper time. The way to bring change is, first of all, to know that the change you are trying to bring is not a bad cause. It's not about your own needs. It's not something that you're being, that you have a personal interest in, but that it's about justice and mercy and compassion. And we are called to care about those things. And then to recognise the proper time, which means two things. It means having empathy for the people in leadership so you can understand the impact of that cause. So having empathy for our politicians about the kids on Nauru, and I think together we need to work out how do we together as a nation care for those kids and address the question of borders. We've got to live in that tension and not just say either or. Does that make sense? Or similarly, for the poker machine owners, we need to work out what does it mean to survive as an owner of a pub while at the same time understanding that poker machines are ripping off families who can least cope with being ripped off in our society. I think it's like $3 million just out of Glenorchy. It's crazy. But if we want to bring change, we need to not just go, it's just that. We need to understand what it means for the politicians and for the pub owners. Does that make sense? Similarly, in your family, you need to understand what it means for your parents, or in your school, what it means for the principal. And in order to do that, Solomon brings us back, and I think in order to understand this subtext of what he's saying, in order to understand the proper time, just like Nehemiah, you pray. Listen for God's direction. That if you want to be someone who makes a difference, you need to be open to what Jesus is asking of you and step into, when Jesus calls you to step forward into an issue, to be ready to step into it. But when he's saying, no, not yet, hold back. We are called to make a difference. We are called to influence people who have influence. And one of the interesting things for me is you look at the Old Testament, and even one of the things we know is that one of the, Erasmus, I think his name was, in Corinth, Dad probably knows, was a member of the local government. And Christians and God's people throughout the Old Testament were always people who seemed to know how to relate to power well. You notice that? Daniel was an advisor to the king. Nehemiah was an advisor to the king. Esther, the whole story of Esther is about how to manage a relationship with authority well. To be a follower of Jesus means to care about those in authority and be willing to step into and have an impact on those. That's not the end of the story, though. Solomon then goes on and says, look, let's be honest, though, nobody actually has power, is what he says next. Since no one knows, this is in verse 7, since no one knows the future, who can tell someone else what is to come? As no one has power over the wind to contain it, so no one has power over the time of their death. As no one is discharged in time of war, so wickedness will not release those who practice it. And he's sort of coming back to the theme he was talking about in the previous chapter. What is he saying? As we engage with people who ostensibly have power, we need to remember that no one really has power over the future, even the weather, the death. No one has power over death, war, and particularly sin. That apart from what Jesus did on the cross, we'll talk more about that, you can't decide, oh, I'm now going to be perfect. That is not an act of, it's not something that is an act of will. Wickedness is something, and this is what he was talking about last week as we looked at it. Wickedness is not something you can fully understand. He even goes on and he says, look, one of the things that we have to face, and he says, all this I saw and I applied my mind to everything done under the sun. There is a time, he says, where a man lords it over others to his own hurt. Then too, I saw the wicked buried, those who used to come and go from the holy place and receive praise in the city where they did this. This too is meaningless. Solomon acknowledges something we all know. There are bad leaders. There are self-interested, corrupt leaders. And it's interesting, as Solomon says, they lord it over others to their own hurt. That being corrupt, being self-interested, damages them as much as it damages anybody else. What's he saying? Ultimately, they end up in the grave. They have no power. You don't need to fear them, is what he's saying. David's just showing me a little beetle here that's pretty good. He goes on and he says, look, one of the things we have to understand, when the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, people's hearts are filled with schemes to do wrong. He's saying something that we come back to as we look at the glory of God in Foundations. He said, all of us are sensitive to justice. When it looks like justice goes missing, when it looks like corruption is the way things work, all of us are sensitive to that. And if justice goes missing, then what is likely to happen is they'll say, oh, well, they get away with it. I'll try and get away with it too. And when justice goes missing, everything falls in on itself. All of us are sensitive to justice, he's saying, but when it goes missing, it affects everyone. And he stands back, because he started this whole chapter by saying, this is how you relate to people in power. Some people are going to be idiots. That's going to be how it is. Sometimes when justice goes missing, it'll feel like things are falling apart. Then he says, although a wicked person who commits 100 crimes may live a long time, I know that it will go better with those who fear God, who are reverent before him. Yet because the wicked do not fear God, it will not go well with them, and their days will not lengthen like a shadow. What he's saying is, look, there are going to be people who are idiots, who are self-centered, who are doing stuff to benefit themselves. I know, he says, in the long run, it's better that with those, life is better for those who go God's way than who go the self-centered way. And it's interesting, I was deeply impacted by the story of Martin Luther King Jr. particularly. And after his death, he was found to have a handwritten note of a quote from a British historian. And that British historian's note changed the way he thought about what he was doing. The historian's name's James Anthony Froude. And what he says is this: one lesson, and only one, history may be said to repeat with distinctness, that the world is built somehow on moral foundations. That in the long run it is well with the good, and in the long run it is ill with the wicked. But this is no science. It's no more than the old doctrine taught long ago by the Hebrew prophets. I bet you James Anthony Froude had been reading Ecclesiastes and much of the Old Testament. That as we step into the life and a life of injustice, there'll be all kinds of temptations to take shortcuts. There'll be all kinds of temptations to say, well, if they get away with it, I'll try and get away with it. And what Solomon's saying, no, don't. That is not the path to life. The path to life is wisdom, is what he's saying. He goes on and says, look, there is something else meaningless that occurs on earth. And he raises probably one of the great dilemmas. He says, the righteous who get what the wicked deserve, and the wicked who get what the righteous deserve. This too, I say, is meaningless. Midnight Oil were right when they say the rich keep getting richer and the poor get the picture. He says sometimes it's just not fair. It looks like the corrupt get ahead. You'll see this theme in the Psalms, and sometimes it looks like the righteous kids or the people who are just struggling to hold it together just lose. What do you do about that? He's saying. Well, Solomon's saying it's meaningless. Remember, the word for meaningless is the Greek word hevel, which means vapor. He's saying it looks like it's got something to it, and if you organise your life to try and fix up the vapor, he's saying it's just not going to go anywhere. You've ultimately got to trust God. You've got to trust the God who says, this is Hebrews chapter 10, if you want to look it up, quoting the Old Testament. We've got to trust the God who says, it is mine to avenge. I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. This is Hebrews 10:30-31. And the writer of Hebrews says, it is a dreadful thing to fall in the hands of the living God. As a follower of Jesus, as a Christian person, we are the ones who say, ultimately justice is in God's hands. And ultimately we can trust that justice will be done. It is not our task to sort justice out for ourselves. You will not ever be able to sort out wickedness and injustice yourself. The only way to peace is to trust that ultimately there will be a day of judgment. And that God, the God of love, is also the God of justice. And He will sort it out in ways we can't even understand. So it's a question of trust. So with all that said, Solomon now says this. He says, so what do you do? What do you do? I like this. He said, this is the theme that from chapter 3 is right the way through the Bible, through the book rather. He says, I commend the enjoyment of life. He says, enjoy your life. God's given you your life. There are going to be moments of joy. Get into them, he's saying, because there is nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. He's saying, it's interesting that the eating and drinking, it's enjoy the little things. Be in the moment with God. That's why I reckon Jesus says, unless you accept the kingdom like a little kid, you're not going to get there. Because kids are in the moment. It was just lovely watching this morning Octavia running around the auditorium over at Mornington, and she was looking for Dan, and her whole body lit up when she saw her daddy. You know, kids are in the moment. They're not preoccupied. And Solomon is saying, don't live your life preoccupied. Be in the moment. He says, then joy will accompany them in their toil. He's saying that there is work for you to do. The assumption of Ecclesiastes and the assumption of the Bible is that there is actually work for you to do. You are not to live your life for yourself. There is a job that you've got, is what it's saying. But you'll find joy in it when you are orientated around God and not around yourself. And he says, all the days of the life God has given them under the sun. We are invited to find joy in the moment by moment adventure of life and work. Aren't you pleased? Your job isn't to fix up all the injustices of the world. Your job is to step into this moment and tomorrow and the next day and enjoy and look for what God's doing. Be on the adventure of life with Jesus. You are called to enjoy playing with the little children. You are called to enjoy doing the work that God's called you to do. You're even called to enjoy a good meal. You are called to enjoy your life. Joy is a fruit of the Spirit. So Solomon then brings it all together again as he tries to, at the end of most chapters, he says, when I applied my mind to know wisdom and to observe the labour that's done on earth, people getting no sleep day or night, then I saw all God has done. No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun. Despite all their efforts to search it out, no one can discover its meaning. Even if the wise claim they know, they cannot really comprehend it. What's he saying? You're not going to find your meaning by working it out. You're going to find the meaning of your life in relationship to the God of the universe who actually knows what he's doing. And I think that circles us back to Matthew chapter 11. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. He's not saying, have a holiday, do whatever you feel like doing. He's saying, no, there is a yoke for you to carry. There is a job for you to do, and sometimes it's going to mean confronting people in power. Sometimes it's going to mean speaking truth to power, but you're going to need to see them as people, not dehumanize them, and step into it and work with me on that, not try and do it yourself, is kind of what he's saying. Take my yoke upon you and listen, learn from me. Well, how are you going at learning from Jesus? You know, Jesus wants to teach you. He wants to make sure that you are a more whole person today than you were yesterday. That you are closer to him today than you were yesterday. And that you'll be closer still tomorrow. He's wanting to do the adventure of life with you. Isn't that good news? Jesus wants to be relating to you. Learn from me, he says, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. These are Jesus' own words. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. As we close, I've just got two questions for you. The first one is this. What is the yoke that you are actually being called to carry? Is it possible that there are yokes you've picked up that are not yours to carry? Burdens that you are picking up that are not yours to carry? I wonder what it means for you to put the burden on the right shoulders. And I love that the picture of the yoke is also, in addition to the rabbinical teaching, is this picture of an oxen's yoke. And the idea is that there's always the bigger oxen is on the one side, and in many ways it can carry the load. You are not being called to do life on your own. Jesus is saying, do life with me. He's saying. So what is the yoke you are actually being called to carry? Are there people in power God is calling you to influence? Let me tell you, there are people in power God is calling. Whether it's when you're going to Centrelink and having to rather than get really annoyed at the person in Centrelink, look in their eyes and understand it's a person you're talking to. Or whether you are in a hospital relating to doctors and people in authority there, and what does it mean to stand up for justice and to see people in that system? Or if you're in a school, in a university, what does it mean to stand up in those places and to see the people in authority and love them, but still keep your eye on the glory of God and on justice, mercy and compassion, and say, Jesus, what are you saying for me here? Just going to finish. One of the things we're working on as a church family is learning how to listen in prayer. It's one thing to tell God stuff. It's another thing to say, okay, God, what do you want to say? So I'm going to close in prayer, and I'm just going to leave a little bit of space. And I invite you just to let the dust settle if you can, and so, Jesus, are there, these two questions, are there yokes? What is the yoke you actually want me to carry? What is the burden that's mine to carry? And secondly, are there people in power you are calling me to influence? Is that okay? We'll pray, and then after that, we'll come and sing a song at both ends. But let's just pray. So Jesus, as we come this morning, thanks for Solomon, who has the courage to call us out beyond ourselves, and to call us both to respect authority, but also to be ready to influence authority. You know, for each one of us, there are times where our faces are not light, where it feels like life is a burden. And we want to come to you, Jesus. We want to give you the burden. We want to only take on the yoke that is ours to carry. So in this moment, can you show, we're just going to create a bit of space now, can you show each one of us, is there something you're wanting to say to us about this? Help us hear the yokes that we've taken on that are not ours to take on. Help us hear the yokes that are ours. If there's been something we're avoiding taking on, Jesus, help us face that and be honest with ourselves about that. And also, Jesus, is there anyone in power you're wanting us to influence? Let's just create a bit of space now. And see if you can let the dust settle, let the voice of the Spirit rise and say, what is it you're saying to me, Jesus? What is it you're saying to me? The voice of the Spirit will never be accusing. It'll be quiet. And see if you, often there'll be a number of voices, but see if you can hear that still small voice that wants to to help you hear what it means to do life with him. So Jesus, as we come this morning, we know for each one of us there's different measures, and sometimes life, there's so much noise it's hard to actually have the space to hear. As a church family though, we want you to be the head of this church. We want you to be guiding us, and as individuals, we want you to be leading us into the adventure with you. We don't want to do life without you. Help us, Jesus, hear your voice. Help us know the yoke that is ours to carry. Help us know if there are people in power you are calling us to influence. Help us be open to that. In your name. Amen. And just as we close, if you do sense that God's been speaking to you, can I encourage you, write it down or do something so you don't lose, because quickly other stuff will come in. See if you can make sure you allow yourself to hear God's voice to you. Back to you, Agnes.